Hello everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at creating a portrait with pen and ink. We're going to use mostly hatching and cross-hatching to complete the portrait. If you enjoy this kind of video, then I'm sure that you'll love our membership program, which includes comprehensive video courses on drawing and painting, ebooks, weekly live lessons, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, a year-long curriculum of lesson plans for visual arts teachers, and much, much more. To learn more about our program, just head over to thevirtualinstructor.com/members or click on the card in the upper corner of this video. You can check out 3 of our course modules, which includes a video and the ebook for free if you'd like. Again, all you have to do is click on the card in the upper corner of this video or click on the link in the description below. With that, I hope you enjoy the following lesson.
For this lesson, we'll be working with Staedtler or Staedtler pigment liner technical drawing pens, and I'm working here on Bristol paper. We're using the vellum surface, and I've created a light contour line sketch and then gently lifted it using a kneaded eraser. Now we're ready to start creating our pen and ink drawing by applying pen and ink to the surface. For the majority of our applications, especially around the face and the hair, we'll be using the 0.05mm pen. This will give us a nice thin line, which will give us a lot of control over the marks. We'll start here by just basically outlining the contours that we already have in place. And it's okay to use a broken line here to indicate some portions of highlight and lighter value. Then we'll slowly start darkening the areas of darkest value first, starting with the pupil and then working our way to the iris. In the area around the iris, we're going to use marks that extend from the center of the pupil. The closer we put these marks to each other, the darker the value, of course. You'll notice here that we've carefully left an area for highlight. This highlight, of course, is very important in creating the impression that the eye is actually wet. Working our way outward, we'll next address the eyelashes. For the top eyelashes, we're going to make check marks, basically somewhat like check marks that go down and then back up. For the lower portion where the eyelashes are less visible and not quite as long, we'll make smaller marks. Then we'll move on to the eyebrow, and of course this is just hair on the face, of course. So we'll use directional stroking to indicate the direction that the hair is growing, and we'll try to make marks that extend out just as the hair would grow. Of course, concentrating these marks in the area where the value is a bit darker. Now we'll move on to our second eye, and we'll address it in the same way. We'll start in the areas that are of darkest value in the pupil, and then of course create lines extending out from the pupil for the iris and to develop the value here. You'll also notice that around the outer portion of the iris, the value is slightly darker, so we'll need to concentrate our lines here a little bit more to create that darker value. In this case, after we've addressed the iris and the pupil, we're now addressing the contour lines around the eye, the upper eyelid, and then moving on to addressing the eyelashes on this side. Again, don't overthink the eyelashes too much. Make sure that your marks are quick. And again, loosen up a little bit. I haven't mentioned this yet, but it's a good idea to loosen up with your drawing, even though we're working with pen and ink here, which might make some folks a little bit nervous because we know that the marks that we put on the surface are there forever. It's still okay to be a little bit loose and a little bit quick with your marks. Here again, with our second eyebrow, we're going to make marks in the direction that the hair grows, and again, concentrate our marks in the areas where the value is slightly darker. Now we'll move on to the nose, and here again we're going to start with just outlining the contours that we already have in place. And here again we'll start in the area of darkest value with the nostrils. In this case, we'll create some hatching here to darken up those values. And then we'll move on to the mouth, and again we'll start by outlining the contours. Now we're going to revisit these features later in the drawing, but right now we're just addressing the main facial features initially. Once we get value down in other portions of the drawing, we can go back and make adjustments. So in this case, we want our overall value range to be a little bit on the lighter side. We can always go back and make things a little bit darker once we have some additional value in place, but of course it's going to be very difficult to make the values lighter if we accidentally make them too dark. So right now we're working a little bit tentatively with our value range. The top lip is going to be a little bit darker than the bottom lip, so that's important to keep in mind. In most cases, the light source will originate from above, and that of course produces a highlight on the bottom lip and a darker upper lip. We'll go ahead and create more contour lines over the top of our graphite sketch. In this case, we've outlined the face, and now we're working down to the clothing. We're going to keep the details very sparse in the clothing and focus mainly on the face, the hair, and the neck. Now we'll move on to defining the contours in the hair. We're going to use quite a bit of broken lines in this section. The hair on this particular subject is rather light around the edges, so we don't want really strongly defined lines on the outside portion. We're also going to think of the hair as far as it being a collection of forms. So this means instead of creating a bunch of stringy lines which won't look representational, nor will it lead to a pleasing drawing, we're going to think about the hair being made up of forms or collections of groupings of hair. And that's what we're defining here at this stage. We're basically defining the groupings of collections of portions of the hair. So now, once we've got these collections defined, now we can go back in and start developing the value in these sections to make them feel more like forms. Of course, we're going to use directional stroking in order to add the value and tone. So we're going to allow our marks to flow over the form of each one of these collections. These types of lines are called cross contour lines, and if you've been around for a while, then you know that cross contour lines are either visible or invisible lines that flow over the form of a subject. And in this case, we're using cross contour lines for each individual collection of hair. And as we do so, as we start defining some of the darker tones and the areas of darker value and the shadows in between each one of these collections, the form of the hair starts to make a bit more sense. So again, instead of using stringy lines, we're thinking about the hair as being a grouping of collections of hair. And of course, we want to rely on the white of the paper to create some of those lighter tones and highlights. Since we can't go back and add lighter tones, we have to be a little bit conservative when we start adding these marks here, because we don't want to get too dark too quickly. You'll also notice that for each collection of hair, the directional strokes that we use change depending on the form of each one of these sections. So it's okay to have contrasting lines, so lines that will go in a certain direction in one section, and a collection of lines that will go in a different direction in another section. Here we can see a close-up of what these lines look like. You can see how I'm changing the direction of the lines based on the individual collections of hair, and some of these collections are rather small and some of these collections are quite a bit larger. Over on the right side of the head, we have a greater number of darker values. So in this section, I'm going to use quite a bit of hatching initially, and then I'll go back and add a bit of cross hatching to make the value a bit darker. You'll notice in most circumstances, the areas where you're going to find the darkest values when it comes to hair are around the face and in areas where you're going to have parts in the hair. You're also going to have the highest level of contrast in these sections as well. We can see there's a slight part on the upper right hand portion of the hair, and we have the highest concentration of lighter values right next to the highest concentration of darker values. We'll continue working down to the ear, and we'll fill in some of that darker value in the recess of the ear. And we'll also use some hatching and cross hatching to darken up the value there. Then we'll move on to the left ear and do the same here. And now we're ready to start adding some of the values to the face. And before we do so, I'm going to use an H graphite pencil and lightly plan out the shapes of darker tone and value here before we start making marks with the pen. Of course, you can skip this step if you feel comfortable, but if you want to, it's a good idea to go in and plan out these shapes of darker value first. Now we're going to go back in with the ink and start developing the value on the face. Now here again, we're going to be rather tentative with our marks. We're going to slowly build up the darker values. We don't want to get too dark too quick or have too many marks on the face that distract, of course, from the facial features. When we're working with pen and ink, of course, since ink is a permanent medium, as we mentioned before, it's a good idea to be tentative in the early stages. Remember, we can always add more, but we can't remove what we've already got on the surface. So we're starting here with mainly directional strokes that are all uniform in direction. They're basically all going in a diagonal at this point. These initial marks, of course, are designed basically just to establish a bit of tone and value. When we start the cross-hatching process, as we are here, we're going to think about the form of the face. So the directional strokes that we make by cross-hatching should flow over the cross contours of the form of the face. This means that these lines may curve and change direction depending on the form of the face. So we're going to be using mainly diagonal stroking to develop the value, and we're going to use mainly cross contour lines to develop the illusion of form, while also adjusting and altering the value, making it slightly darker. So you can see here with a bit more value underneath the bottom portion of the nose starts to look like it protrudes out. And we'll also define a little bit of darker value around the eyes to make them appear like they recede. And you can see in this case I'm working in multiple areas, and this is because I'm slowly building up the value. And as I'm building up the value, I'm making comparisons with areas that we've already addressed, trying to make sure that the drawing stays consistent. We can thicken up the line at the bottom of the chin and vary the line quality or line thickness to add a little bit more interest. And then we'll continue on developing some of the darker values on the face. In this case, I'm working down the bridge of the left side of the nose. It's important, of course, to be patient in this process. We don't want to rush it, but we also want to stay relatively loose with our marks, as I mentioned before. Here you can see our lines are slightly curved around the cheek to help create that illusion of form. And now, before going further with our development of values on the face, we'll develop some of the values on the neck, because the contrast and values that we create here are important for the rest of the development of the face. We'll start here by using mainly cross contour lines with some hatching that flow around the bottom portion of the neck. You can see how this line curves based on the curvature of the neck. We'll also darken up some of the shadow on the inside portion of the collar. Of course, we're using quite a bit of cross-hatching here to make the value quite a bit darker. And then we can go back to the neck and start developing some of the darker tones there to create a little bit more of an impression of form. Now, since the face protrudes outward, we're going to see some of the darkest values exist here on the neck, right underneath the chin. So we'll progressively build up darker values with some cross-hatching here, again considering the form of the neck. Now, the darker you make the value,